any secrets of the Mau Mau, this oath will kill me. If I am called in the night and refuse to come, this oath will kill me. If I see anyone steal white man's property, I must help him. I must hide what he gives me and say nothing, or this oath will kill me.
The whole system in this country, the economic system, is such that jobs are scarce. Automation is limiting jobs. It's decreasing jobs. And as automation eliminates the job opportunities, legislation will not create job opportunities. All it will do is bring about friction and hostility between the two races.
You see, there will be no progressive revival if black folks are not deeply involved in it.
I will obey all orders of the Mau Mau, or this oath will kill me.
Peace and greetings to friends, comrades, and enemies. My name is Pascal Robert. I am the host of the Mau Mau Hour. Today we're going to be talking about a recent occurrence that happened in the Middle East. On December 8th, Bashar al-Assad was forced to evacuate the Republic of Syria and leave after a 13-year struggle for that geographical territory's sovereignty and control. After an assault by Hayat I believe the proper pronunciation is Hayat al-Shams, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Shams, which is a constellation of a terrorist-led organization that came to power after replacing some of the other prior forces that have been attacking Assad. Today, we're going to discuss what exactly is the consequence of Assad's fall. What does this fall mean, and how he got to this position, and how exactly his regime came to power. Our guests are going to be some TIR all-stars in terms of the subject of the Middle East. Our first guest is the one and only Jean Bajlan.
Hello, Pascal. Good to see you.
Good to see you. We have the one and only our man from the inside, Deep State Cuba.
Hello, everybody. Peace and greetings.
And our good professor, friend, I cannot begin to pronounce her last name, Professor Elitra.
Electra Kostopoulou. Is it more difficult than the terrorist-led group to pronounce, or I'm just sorry? Hi, nice to see you. I just found the similarities interesting.
Well, folks, all of you guys are experts in the Middle East to some very extent. I brought you on because I wanted to have a somewhat casual, informal conversation about what has brought us here. Why is there so much division, particularly on the left, about this region? And what exactly is the path forward for what we're going to see? First, I would like our good friend Jean Bajlan to give a history for those who are not initiated. Can you explain to us who were the Assad regime? Bashar, who was the son of Hafiz al-Assad. How did the Assads come to power? What do they represent? What faction of Arab political history do they represent? And exactly how did it become a force in the Republic of Syria?
Yeah, okay. So Baathism was a kind of, a form of pan-Arab nationalism that, drew on sort of socialist traditions, but also fascistic traditions as well. Many of its intellectual founders were Christians. Michel Aflaq, for example, was one important figure, and so this was a strand within the kind of pan-Arab movement that emerges in the kind of moment of decolonization. Now, in terms of the Ba'ath Party's rise to power, we see the Ba'ath Party rising to power in both Iraq and in Syria in the early 1960s. Within the context of Syria, the Ba'ath Party sort of come to power in the early 1960s in reaction to the failed project, the United Arab Republic, which had been initiated by Nasser, and the Egyptians had brought Syria and Egypt into a kind of single country. There was a coup against the kind of Nasserist faction. Many people in Syria felt that, Syrians were kind of playing second fiddle to the Egyptians, and the kind of pan-Arab project that Nasser was pushing forward was more of a kind of covert Egyptian imperialism. Anyway, so we have the Baathists come to power, and then, following the debacles of the wars with Israel in the late 1960s, we see Hafez al-Assad coming to power in a kind of in a coup. So another faction, if you like, of the Ba'ath Party coming to power. Now, then, of course, the Ba'ath Party in Syria ended up coming into conflict with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, but they kind of represented a secular nationalist strand within pan-Arab nationalism, and yeah, basically that's how I would put it. And very often, the Baathism, both in Iraq and Syria, came to be a cover for the rule of particular sectarian minorities. So obviously, we have in Syria Baathism serving as a cover for the domination of the Assad family and their supporters within the Alawite community. Although the Alawite community were not all on board with Baathism. I think that's important to point out. Similar to the way in Iraq that Baathism became a kind of cover for Sunni domination in a majority Shia country. So this is a kind of secular nationalist project that emerges in the decolonial moment, but begins to basically decline from its inception. And these regimes, although proclaiming a kind of universal pan-Arabism, were often undergirded by a de facto kind of sectarian politics, even if it wasn't necessarily expressed so clearly in that way.
Particularly, yes, in the case of the Assad regime, they were Alawites, as you stated, which was a rather despised and often persecuted regime in Syria, if I'm not mistaken, going back many, many years. With some people, one of the sayings in the Muslim world about the Alawites is that some people don't even consider them Muslims. And as a matter of fact, that they were so, quote unquote, deviated from the normal practices. I'm sure you would know more about that than I would, Gene, in terms of the...
Well, we can think about them as a kind of heterodox Islamic sect, that a Shia-leaning heterodox Islamic sect. I would definitely call them Muslims, but of course, many Sunni Muslims may have different opinions on that. As we know, often within religious communities, there are kind of big divisions over who is and who is not part of that community. But of course, Alawites would probably define themselves as Muslims, even though their belief systems and practices are perhaps different from the Sunni majority that exists in Syria.
What was the main reason that the Assad regime for so many years was being supported by the Russians or the former Soviet Union?
I mean, in terms of
why don't we move that to Cuba? Cuba, do you want to answer that question?
Certainly, I can chime in. The one final dimension I would emphasize about the Ba'athist regime in Syria was that it claimed to be a socialist, revolutionary, anti-imperial movement. And as a result, it attracted a lot of sympathy from Western leftists, pan-Arabists, international revolutionary types, especially since it had a consistent record in supporting anti-American, anti-Western forces, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria was not a party to any of the Israeli peace agreements in the region, unlike Jordan and Egypt, which were considered to be more leaning towards the Americans during the Cold War period. Syria's isolation, unwillingness to collaborate with Western governments, the hostile relationship that it had with the UK, with France, with the United States, made it a relatively natural fit for a Soviet ally in the region, especially after the relative alienation of Iraq. during the Saddam period. So in return, the Syrians received an area for operations and intelligence gathering in the Middle East, as well as some basing and military infrastructure that allowed them to project power. That relationship, of course, ends with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but because of continuities on both within the Syrian Ba'athist regime, which same people, same institutions, and the sort of Putinite connections to the intelligence agencies through the from the FSB back to the KGB and Soviet military intelligence, their predecessors, it was easy to restart that relationship, especially since the underlying geopolitical arrangements hadn't really shifted. Syria remained isolated from the West, from American-led globalization, despite the fact that it was a Gulf War, relatively speaking, ally against Iraq, both in the first and second American wars. And it became, that relationship was revived, and until the fall of the Assad regime, one of its biggest sponsors, backers, international allies, arms suppliers, intelligence partners, you name it, was the Russian Federation. The other being Iran.
So as you state, there was a geostrategic relationship between Russia and the Soviet Union and the Assad regime going back to the Cold War that basically, for continuity purposes, continued up until after the Cold War, that facilitated, because of Russia's kind of outlier position in the world, a more natural support. Now, one of the questions I wanted to ask also is that there are reports that there may be some resource allocation within Syria that justify an interest in what's going on in that country. What about the reports of natural gas in Syria and its importance to either the United States or to Russia as one of the motivations to maintain it within the purview of the sovereignty of those, the Western powers and the greater chessboard, if you will?
Let me chime in on the economics of it. Syria is not a winner when it comes to resource allocation, when it comes to any sort of economic heft. One of the motivations that for the Turks to prompt HTS to launch this offensive is because without something to show for it, without some control over the sovereign apparatus of Syria, then the entire Idlib sector, where the Sunni resistance was based, had to be bankrolled by the Turks. And it was extremely expensive. It was drawing down Turkish state budgets. So they wanted to see some kind of payoff. And the reality is that Syria, because of its isolation and the length of its isolation, because of domestic tension and the fact that the regime has been security first for so long, is not a particularly valuable economic prize. There is oil in the east, and there is strategically valuable but not economically valuable agriculture as well along the Euphrates. But whatever intervening powers can make up through natural gas extraction or mining, or more likely pipelines and transit fees, will be pennies compared to what it takes to effectively play for dominance in the Syrian territories.
Gene, do you want to jump in?
No, I mean, I know there is discussion about sort of various pipeline projects in, explaining the conflict in Syria, but I would probably say those are second order issues at present. I mean, especially for a country like Turkey, as Kuba points out, one of the big reasons Turkey would want to have a resolution is not only the cost of maintaining its support for certain groups in Syria, but also the fact that Turkey has millions of Syrian refugees. And within Turkish politics, those Syrian refugees have become a kind of hot potato issue. You have this very well-known former Turkish MP, Umut Özdağ, who, was a kind of standalone guy, but it was kind of a bit like a Nigel Farage kind of character who was able to drive Turkish political discourse to a great degree. So there's enormous amount of kind of tension with Syrians in Turkey that have kind of become perhaps an electoral liability for the Erdogan government. So there's a desire for Turkey to be able to repatriate these millions of Syrian refugees into Syria as well. So there's that kind of economic rationale behind it. Syrians provided a lot of cheap labor, for example, for big mega projects in Turkey. But as the Turkish economy stalls, there are just, you have the same kind of anti-immigrant politics as you have in other parts of the world taking place.
Literally, I wanted to ask you a question as a member of the left, particularly someone who's very strong in the pro-Palestinian world. Some, particularly on the left, are decrying the fall of the Assad regime and saying that it's the fall of the last anti-Zionist regime in the area. And that basically we're saying that Assad, even though, he may have been an abuser of his power, he was opposed to American imperialism in the area. Based on your understanding, why is there so much of a conflict on the left in terms of analyzing what exactly is the position leftists should have towards Assad, the Assad regime, the removal or supporting of the Assad regime, or supporting the removal of the Assad regime? Why is this such a position, an area of consternation from your analysis?
Right. So thank you. First of all, let me clarify that I wouldn't identify as somebody who has been traditionally very strong as a pro-Palestinian activist. That's not what I have been doing with myself and my work for most of my life. It is what I perceive as the extreme circumstances of this, right? It's not a new situation, absolutely, but it was one of the many, many issues in the problematic Cold War legacy in the Middle East that I have engaged with. It wasn't Palestine in a vacuum. The reason why I became so involved in all of it as of recently, and I'm sorry, I want to clarify this because I think it's important, is because I'm now an American citizen, and as an American citizen, I felt that the escalation of atrocity in the past year on the end of Israel, which is spiraling completely out of control on all fronts, and the shameful, criminal, really enabling of that genocide on the end of the United States of America is a turning point, right? So the way I perceive it, Palestine is the tip of the iceberg right now that reveals a whole network of corruption, autocracy, the whole system of government, matrix of government rather, from Egypt to Turkey to Syria to Lebanon and Israel, with Saudi Arabia and Iran playing the regional, rivals role and all that. It's just has been a system that was created during the Cold War. It was more messy, I would argue, than the previous analysis on the end of our friends here suggests, and we can revisit that point later on. So there was a whole system of corruption, violence, and autocracy that was put in place during the Cold War. I wouldn't describe it as a chessboard game because it was always more messy. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of far-right Russia as a new type of player, and the US yes, acting for a while as the only global superpower in charge of things, and very quickly proven itself to be not in charge of anything, quite frankly, but shameless profiteering and carnage. Right now, we have reached a turning point for the whole region, and what's happening in Gaza, the unfolding genocide, is just the most gruesome, tangible aspect of this whole system that is, in my view, collapsing in the context of unprecedented violence, right? So I wanted to clarify that I would contextualize Gaza and Palestine in general by reference to that broader framework. Now, as to the left, clearly the argument that the Assad regime was somehow a good player or the lesser evil in that context is ridiculous. And I think this is one of the points Jean and I feel very strongly about. Do I have to elaborate as to why celebrating a totalitarian, delusional dictator? Because this is one of the main particularities of Bashar al-Assad that make him unique. He was not somebody who was meant for power. He wasn't even one of these usual, dictatorial, militant figures that came to power by playing the game and all that. He found himself in power by accident after his brother died, right, who was prepared for that role. And this is perhaps why Syria became such an anomaly in the context of the Arab Spring. With him living in his own world, he wasn't able to perhaps appreciate what was going on in his own country. That would be my assessment of it. And with Russia and many other actors taking advantage of the situation, clearly, to serve their own agenda. So to celebrate all this as somehow the lesser evil is, number one, a historical. I said it's ridiculous, and I would stand by that position. It is ridiculous, morally, ethically, and from the perspective of any frame of analysis. And it's quite a historical, because whether we hate American imperialism or not, and whether we are in a position to criticize, as we should, I would argue, the harm and really instability that the United States of America have introduced into this whole region. Russia participated in the Cold War dynamic of terror, the Soviet Union, and in producing that dynamic, right? And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became an even more erratic and dangerous actor. Erratic is not the right word. So we are referring to a context, a matrix, a system, right, of external interventions. And the totalitarian, autocratic, dictatorial regimes, terrorist groups, all actors that played that game, participated in this game, were enabled by that game. So on the one side, we have this whole matrix, the superpowers fighting against one another, or participating in the superficial Cold War dynamic, producing so much violence and chaos. And then the local actors that played the game and tried to navigate these waters and used it to their own advantage when they could, to promote their own dictatorial and autocratic tendencies. And that's one side of the story. And the other side of the story, as I said, is ordinary people who are all devastated by this situation and have been devastated by this situation for decades now. And quite frankly, I think that this is an artificial external analysis, which is offensive. I mean, the fact that so many on the end of the so-called left, I would say, fail, number one, to appreciate that people on the ground have agency. And first and foremost, we should listen to what they have to say about the situation on the ground. Does anybody among local actors, again, I'm referring to ordinary people in the Arab world, broadly defined, has anything positive to say about Bashar al-Assad and his regime of horror, especially in the past decade or so? It would be very, very difficult to find any group, including but not limited to Palestinians themselves, who, despite getting slaughtered as we speak, this is something that continues in Gaza and the West Bank, they celebrated the collapse of Bashar al Assad because they do understand what torture and totalitarianism and sacrificing civilian lives means better than anybody else. So these external black and white analysis, oh, if Americans are the bad guys because they're so strong and terrible, I mean, not that we're not that, but that does not imply that, the Americans are the bad guys, the Russians thereby by implications are nothing but the good guys, and whomever is used or tries to use the Russians is also a positive, force. It's an ahistorical, ridiculous, and I would say quite offensive framework of analysis. Offensive to whom? To the Syrian people, first and foremost, that celebrated the collapse of the Assad regime almost universally. Yes, there is anxiety about the future. We do not really know what's going to come out of it, but Assad was a really, really bad actor in lack of a different characterization that captures better the situation. And he was a very telling manifestation of this broader system, game, matrix of violence that relies on denying these regions any chance to actual representation, if not from below, at least from the middle, right? To elevate regional agency to something more than just a reference in an alleged game of chess. I don't know if I have answered your question, but to make it a little more clear, if anybody asked me what should be the position of the left in all this, clearly it should be to try and recognize any type of regional agency that can emerge and coexist in this region, and all kinds of external interventions are extremely problematic, and the regimes that benefit from external interventions are extremely problematic as well. It really is as simple as that.
How do you respond to the argument that those who say that the parties that are actually going to be replacing Assad are going to be no different than what exactly happened in Libya, in that we have these various terrorist front groups who are going to come in and perpetuate horrors in the name of their, kind of jihadist tendency du jour, and be even worse than the marginal kind of stability that Assad represented while he was governing, under the guise of whatever geopolitical player is willing to arm them or stabilize them in the area. Even more so, it opens the door for countries like Israel, who right now are bombing Damascus, bombing Syria, and furthering Zionist expansionism as well in the area. And as Jean mentioned, Turks are very happy to use this for their geostrategic purposes as well, with their own kind of imperial designs on the region as well. So as much as we may say that Assad was a horrible, autocratic ruler in the area, he was one of many that maintained a stability that was recognizable compared to the complete chaos that will be unleashed in his absence. And I like all of you to jump in and respond to that, because because I'll be very transparent. My position is that I am no apologist for Assad at all. As a person, as a Muslim who was a Sunni, and he was not exactly a kind to people who were my co-religionists by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, my position has always been, I don't support an American-led or American-supported jihadist tendencies that will bring forth more chaos. And I'd rather deal with the monster we know than the genie in the bottle we will let loose and try to deal with it from there. And that was as far as it went. But I would see for people who even demonstrated that tendency being called a sadist or this or that, and it was just at one point it just got very, very violent in terms of the rhetoric on the left in terms of who supports what in this whole debate. And I was just wondering, why is this area that most people couldn't recognize on a map 6 months ago, 6 months before the Arab Spring, causing so much ideological bloodlust on the left? Gene or Kuba, if you guys want to jump in, I am more than willing to have you guys do so.
Well, I would question the assumption that Assad represented stability, or any of the Ba'ath regimes represented stability. At the end of the day, for example, Saddam Hussein's military adventurism in Iran and eventually in Kuwait, which brought his downfall, was not an anomaly in his policy. It was intimately linked to the crises that were taking place within Iran. The Iranian Revolution, for example, was a threat to Saddam Hussein's domination, or at least was perceived as a threat to Saddam Hussein's domination of Iraq and Sunni domination of Iraq in a Shia majority country. With regards to Syria, people will forget this, but Assad was the CIA was renditioning people to Syria during the war on terror. Syria, from I think from the 1980s, was moving towards more neoliberal economics. You have this infitah policies being adopted, and eventually a combination of environmental crisis. There was serious droughts across Syria and Iraq during the 2000s. The kind of declining economic system, the sclerotic politics, created a powder keg that exploded. And, the situation was no doubt made worse by ongoing foreign intervention. But let us not forget that, you have these protests, and then rather than moving towards some kind of reform, these protests were crushed. And as in many of these movements, the first people who get crushed are kind of the liberals and the socialists. And at the end of the day, the only groups that survive are those sort of hardcore jihadist movements. So I think the Assad regime itself created this recipe for instability in Syria, and it was only a matter of time, I think, before that regime went into crisis. That's not to sort of say that the external powers that have been involved in Syria don't bear any responsibility for it. But I would just question that kind of assumption that at least these people provided stability, because evidently they did not, because you had a protest movement breakout, which was then leveraged by various foreign powers to advance their interests, whether that was through backing a weak Assad or working with the opposition to foment regime change.
Cool. And I think you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I think that there's, especially in terms of where leftist sympathies should lie, we haven't mentioned one of the biggest and most relevant pieces, which is the YPG statelet of the Syrian Kurds. Between Assad and the HTS opposition, there's no natural affinity for leftists. Maybe a vague appeal to anti-imperialism by some people who have a excessively romantic view and excessively credulous intake of the whole Iranian discourse of the axis of resistance. But the YPG effort is a genuine attempt at a secular socialist revolutionary state in territory that had been liberated from Assad and protected from the Islamic State. And the YPG played an absolutely heroic role in the opposition to ISIS. The one which, frankly, I would say was not tainted in the least by their association with the United States. You go with the partners that you have, and they compromised as little as possible in terms of their ideological vision and their administration internally. But they have serious and dangerous enemies, especially the Turkish government, which sees them as an extension of the PKK and a threat to the domestic order within Turkey, as well as Turkey's regional ambitions. And one of the few places where one could say that perhaps Assad was playing a stabilizing role was his working relationship with the YPG and the sort of toleration, mutual toleration between the YPG and the Assad government during the civil war period, as opposed to the Turkish state or the Sunni opposition, which very frequently did everything in its power to destroy the YPG and undermine its ability to resist ISIS. So I think that it's important to, looking at Syria, to realize that beyond the Sunni Shia, Alawite, Assadist versus HTS, jihadist dichotomy, there is an entire constellation of different communities with different interests, different institutions for political mobilization, different groups representing their organization, as well as a very complicated web for outside actors to try to manipulate and play in. And of course, sometimes the dialectic goes the other way, that outside actors get manipulated by the domestic players. The United States ended up backing Sunni jihadist tendencies, but that was not necessarily plan A for them, but where you end up after successive rounds of very badly played intervention. Similarly, Assad was the natural partner of the Russian Federation, but not an ideal one. They spent the last few months desperately begging Assad for greater investment in domestic security and in more pliability to reach a diplomatic settlement with Turkey that would prevent this type of collapse. But Assad was obstinate, despite relying on Russia for crucial backing and ending up in Russia after this all went down. So the situation is much more complex. And I think that we should also consider the fate of third parties like the Syrian Kurds in the way that we analyze the potential fallout from the collapse of the Syrian Ba'athist state.
Well, Gene, can you speak to that? What are the rules? I mean, the Kurds are a very serious wild card in this area. What exactly is it the result of this? What does this mean for the Kurds in this region? And can you talk also to us about Turkey? I mean, I think one of the things we should do on the show is to go down the list of the geostrategic players in terms of what they're trying to get out of this. The United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and see exactly how this plays out for them. So, Gene, if you want to talk about, what did you want to say? The lecture, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to say that I would fully agree with emphasizing the complexity of it, right now and even before. These are not clear alliances in any way. I just want to emphasize that I am not sure that what you said before, Pascal, I would agree with you if that were an American-led conspiracy that, is this is how it is presented at times, and maybe this is where the disagreement is. I'm not sure that the United States of America is on top of anything at this point. I really feel that different actors are trying just to react to the collapse of the Assad regime. And I have a wild theory about it as well. We can talk about it later if you want. But this is not an American victory the way I see it. And I don't believe anybody saw that coming. As to what Israel does right now, it's again one of these irrational, violent, aggressive types of distraction or destructive. Look, Netanyahu is on trial in Israel. He's now bombing yet another country, despite the fact that the regime just fell, right? So there is no arguable reason for that, trying to distract the public from what's happening within Israel. If you ask me, in the long term, despite the violence of the and aggression of Israel, or because of it in the short term, in the long term, I believe this is a disaster for Israel. This is not a sustainable situation. And I do not see this as a well-executed plan on the end of American imperialism or Zionism or whatnot. It's a chaotic situation. What happened in Syria wasn't anticipated by the usual actors, and everybody is now responding in different ways. So I just wanted to make a comment on that.
So I have no problem, believing that at all. But what I find interesting is that both the leaders of the United States and Israel were celebrating with glee when Hizbut, it's hard for me to pronounce that name. HTS took over the area in Syria, and as a matter of fact, Netanyahu literally took credit and said, "But for himself and Israel, Assad would not have not been toppled." Joe Biden proudly said that his support for Ukraine forced the Russians to back down their support of Assad, which is what allowed his government to collapse. So, I mean, I'm not unwilling to agree with your analysis, Electra, but if this does not have the hands of the West on it, then why are they so willing to celebrate the actual effects of this occurrence?
I don't think the United States celebrated anything. I think what defines us as of recently is our incompetence to keep up with what's going on, and considering the climate within this country and internal dynamics. The way I would describe American foreign policy, the term I always use is incompetence. We are not on top of things.
But it can be both. It can be both.
Of course, yeah.
There's a geopolitical malpractice at work by the United States, certainly. And I don't just mean that there's a deliberate plan for some kind of malign order. I think if you looked at the rhetoric used in planning documents at the DoD, at the State Department, then it would still be 90s globalization, democracy, global society type values underpinning what are delusionally optimistic visions for American leadership. So the incompetence, sure, yeah, that's definitely part of it. However, it is this was definitely a welcome regime change in Washington, D.C. And I would point out that during the Syrian civil war, one of the main sources of weapons for the rebels was the Libyan arsenals that were transferred through CIA rat lines via Turkey into the hands of the Syrian opposition. So that was an American effort to foster regime change and to strengthen the Sunni opposition to Assad. So there are American fingerprints on it.
Of course, there's no doubt about that. But the current developments, right?
The current developments.
The collapse of the Assad regime is definitely a welcome outcome. I'm referring about the nature of developments in these past weeks and the actors that are now in charge.
And I would point out that consider that Mohammed al-Jilani, the very first major interview that he does with international press is with the CNN. And the amount of effort that's visible in the mainstream media to try to reframe the HTS opposition as generally, our friends, the Mujahideen, liken Rambo to the one that he goes to Afghanistan, right? To try to whitewash the Al-Qaeda history of much of the leadership of HTS and to present them as somebody that we can work with. There's a tremendous attempt to rehabilitate the Sunni opposition. And whether or not this was wise or foreseen is another matter. But there's definitely a bit of a victory lap in terms of getting rid of Assad. And it also is a face-saving measure, given how badly the war in Ukraine is going, to say that, oh, look, here's a tangible win that we can chalk up in our rivalry with Russia. Where we go from here, well, on the American side, Pascal, let me start with like what American interests might be in the region. And the greatest rival that the United States faces for its attempts to reestablish order in the Middle East has always been Iran. Iran has much deeper connections, deeper and more organic connections to the states of the Middle East. It frustrated American attempts to reconfigure Iraq to the liking of the United States. It's a bugbear of America's allies in the Gulf, and of course, the number one enemy of Israel. And Syria represented the keystone of the land bridge connecting Lebanon and the Palestinian territories to an Iranian industrial base for the logistical movement of troops, material, weapons. Without Syria playing that role, is going to be much more difficult for Hezbollah in Lebanon, most notably, to effectively organize and to be able to rebuild itself as a fighting force. So that severing the axis of resistance is a big American victory in terms of their interests in the region. The United States also can use this as an opportunity to try to reestablish a more productive relationship with Turkey, which has been playing its own regional games, and part of which is being the main sponsor of HTS and the main host of Syrian refugees.
Electra, do you want to jump in?
I have. Listen, I disagree with the fundamental premises on which your analysis is built, starting with this idea that somehow the U.S. tries to introduce order or to defend on order in the Middle East, but because
I'm
would
saying it would like to impose its own version of order.
Right. I would disagree with that as well. I think that at this point, like the only consistent strategy is to introduce our own version of chaos, which is I can explain more in terms of like business interests rather than any type of geopolitical understanding of
business interests require order as well.
Not necessarily, not if it's business interests that have to do with a constant crisis and management of crisis and weapon trafficking and then addressing it through humanitarian missions and all that, right? That's a different type of industry. But I would like, I'm sorry, I interrupted Jean before. So because that's a longer discussion, a very interesting one, can we just put a pin on it and revisit it? Because I see the whole context very differently. And I would like to apologize to Jean because I interrupted him initially to address the previous point, and we can revisit it later on. I see it very differently as to what the US is trying to do and how local actors respond to it all.
Jean, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, which point would you like me to respond?
I think I wanted you to talk about the Kurds, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Kurdish issue in Syria is very tense at the moment. I mean, from the left perspective, the cardinal sin of the YPG was to make an alliance with the United States within the context of the war against ISIS. I mean, we can have our views on U.S. imperialism, but, you know, from the perspective of local actors, I don't think they really had much choice or option. It was either that or self-liquidate. I mean, in terms of Turkey's interests, of course, you know, I've mentioned the desire to have Syrian refugees return, but of course, another major component to Turkish policy is to ensure that the YPG, the PYD, and the various constellation of political forces that in Syria that are associated with the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, are defeated. Turkey has had a long history of warfare against the PKK. For years, the Syrian government backed the PKK. The PKK was based in Lebanon during the 1980s, and basically Turkey threatened to invade in the late 1990s, which forced Syria to scale down its support for the PKK. Now, one of the aspects of Syrian policy towards the Kurds in Syria, within Syria, was to kind of encourage Kurds within Syria to direct their political activism towards Turkey. The Syrian government, denied large numbers of Kurd citizenship, claimed that they were not real Syrians, etc., etc. However, when the regime was in crisis, the YPG and the PYD, the kind of Syrian wing of the PKK, filled that vacuum as the Syrian army withdrew from Kurdish areas in order to, redeploy its limited forces to combat threats that it saw as more pressingly dangerous. And so obviously that was very disturbing to Turkey, but really became disturbing to Turkey after 2015 for a variety of reasons internal to Turkey. It's important to remember, that Turkey is acting as if the Syrian Kurdish. There's no way that they could cooperate with the Syrian Kurdish movement, but before 2015 they were cooperating with them. They actually allowed Kurdish forces from Iraq to transit through Turkey to assist YPG forces at the Battle of Kobani. So what happened in Turkey was, Erdogan shifted the base of his support. Previously, before 2015, he had been hoping to win Kurdish support to build his strong presidential system. After the 2015 election, the Kurdish political parties within Turkey stood against him. So he reorientated himself, drawing on nationalist support from the nationalist movement in the Turkish nationalists in Turkey, and adopted a kind of hard line against the Syrian Kurdish political forces, and were able to certain degree exploit tensions within the Kurdish political forces inside Syria. You have the PYD, the YPG, and all these sort of different these kind of constellation of groups that are, I wouldn't call them a Syrian branch of the PKK anymore. There's a long history of Kurdish political organizations, organizing on both sides of the border and eventually splitting off and becoming two political parties. There's a KDP of Iraq and there's a KDP of Iran. And so you had splits within the Syrian Kurds where you have sort of pro Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK factions, and then you have pro Barzani factions. Those are factions that are close to the Iraqi Kurdish administration. And, Turkey was able to exploit those differences. And then, of course, it has deployed its own Syrian National Army, which are a kind of a group of some, various militias that include jihadists, ethnic Turks from Syria, etc., and they've deployed those against the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the umbrella organization, which the PYD and YPJ and YPG, operate under. So there's kind of a big tension there. And my hope is that this can be resolved without warfare and can be, but at present pro-Turkish forces connected to the Syrian National Army, which is a separate group from HTS, which is the Turkish. It's a Turkish-backed group, separate from HTS, are currently moving against Kurdish forces in Syria. So we'll see how that plays out. The Kurdish Autonomous Region in Syria, the was, in effect, able to operate because of the weakness of the Assad regime. But now that that regime has fallen, we don't know what direction politics are going to go. Will Turkey force the dissolution? I mean, Turkey has issued a demand, for peace. They want all the PKK cadre, including those who are Syrian, to leave the country, and for the entire movement to disarm, which strikes me as that's not really a negotiation position that the Syrian Kurdish opposition can really accept. It just doesn't seem very realistic. Seems more for like the Austrian ultimatum to the Serbs, where it's like surrender or die, or the way that Israel often approaches Hamas, say that you can end the war tomorrow if you completely surrender and give up and leave. To where, who knows? So there's a lot of uncertainty in that particular direction about the way things will go, because Turkey is at present implacably hostile to the constellation of Kurdish forces that are dominant in northeastern Syria.
Well, we're coming up on an hour, so in that sense, can we actually get a summary from each of you in terms of where you guys see this going in the immediate future, in terms of what's going on in Syria? If you have your crystal balls, if you will.
Well, I guess I'll start a bit here. I mean, I think people are talking a lot about the people are whitewashing the Al-Qaeda origins of the opposition that's now in power, which is certainly true. But I also think that it's entirely plausible that they may have reformed, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a new Syrian government that adopts a kind of neoliberal politics to attract foreign investment to rebuild the country. There's no inherent contradiction between Islamism and neoliberal capitalism. I think a lot of Islamists, when they think of what development is, their idea of development is mosque construction and shopping center construction, and that they look to places like Istanbul or the Gulf for their developmentalist models. So it's going to be interesting what kind of line the new government takes. How will they? It'll be interesting to see how they approach the United States, how they will respond to Russia, what kind of relationship they'll have with Russia, how Iran will deal with this. Iran has lent billions to the Syrian government. They're probably not going to get that money back. And then, of course, we have Turkey, which is still occupying territory in Syria, in certain parts of Syria, most notably Afrin. But you also have the Israelis expanding from the Golan Heights. How will this new government deal with how will they deal with the kind of states that are occupying Syrian territory? A lot of people are criticizing Jolani, saying like, well, he said he's not going to fight Israel, but what would he fight Israel with at the moment? I mean, I think one of the most telling things about what that kind of gives me the idea that the Israelis might have been caught off guard, and also that they might have preferred a weak Assad, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, is that they obviously had penetrated the Syrian state so deeply that they knew where all the weapons were. So as soon as the regime fell, they just bombed everything, all the weaponry that they had, which they knew where it was all along. And that sort of suggests to me that this was a surprise, because they didn't see this coming necessary, and that had they wanted to, they could have at any time destroyed the Syrian government's military capacity. But it's interesting that they waited until after the fall of the regime to do that. So I don't know where things are going to go. I'm very curious to see how far this new government goes with the Islamization of society, what kind of economic policies they adopt, and what their posture will be to the foreign powers, and of course, how will they negotiate with the Kurds in the country? What role will Turkey play in shaping that negotiation, since the HTS has close relations with Turkey? So there's a lot of unanswered questions. So I would not want to crystal ball or predict anything right now, because everything seems in complete flux. We have Israeli tanks a few miles away from Damascus, and Turkish forces still attacking American-backed forces across the country. So, Syria has been a bloodbath. Maybe we're at the end of this bloodbath, but I still think still think there's enormous amount of potential for this to go south and for violence to occur. We'll see how it turns out, I guess.
Cool, but you wanted to pick up the slack?
Yes, certainly. And I think that clear-cut predictions are going to be impossible in this messy situation, but we can point to certain features of the political environment and derive some implications from them. One is that the Syrian resistance, as well as the Syrian state, are both exhausted from fighting. That's the justification given for refusal to challenge Israel, that the Syria is exhausted, weapons are depleted, what would we even fight them with? And I think that's, to quote Henry Kissinger, it's one of those explanations which has the secondary benefit of being true. I don't think that there is a great deal of coercive capacity that anyone in Syria can muster against a force as heavily armed and organized as the IDF. I think that Gene makes a very good point that the Syrian state had been heavily penetrated by Mossad. They knew where the weapons were. I'd point out that one of the biggest differences that came with the collapse of the Assad regime was the disorganization of things like air defenses, right? The breakdown of the chain of command in the Syrian Arab army. So the Israelis had much more of a free hand this week than they did in the past. It was much more difficult to resist Israeli aggression if you were in Syrian territory. There was no longer any kind of deterrent effect that the Syrian government or Syrian authorities would be able to muster a response. So the Israelis have enjoyed absolute impunity in a way that I think was unprecedented in the past. Assad was able to at least muster some kind of front that vanished with his ouster. I think that the pressure right now for some kind of breathing room, some kind of respite from decades of war, is pushing Jolani, as out of pure opportunistic self-interest, to cozy up to the United States, to avoid triggering open conflict with Israel. And this means saying the right things, appearing on CNN. He's reached out to elements of the former government. There's going to be they're working on an interim government, which would include some representatives from the former regime. And there'll be some sort of process in place for an inclusive national government that is going to at least be able to present to the international community as somewhat representative and optimistic. But that's been the case in all kinds of post-conflict states, places like Somalia, places like Libya. And unfortunately, these governments tend to be short-lived. They tend to have a very limited scope of control. They rely on a small number of effectively organized groups and foreign backers. And that, like Gene said, Syria's been a bloodbath for a long time. I think that there's a few chapters left of conflict before we reach any type of conclusion, which may require not just a national level settlement to the Syrian civil war, but a regional reworking of the regional political and security order, which is something that I see as necessary, but also at least a decade away. There's the Israelis are much too aggressive and much too optimistic about their ability to unilaterally rewrite the facts on the ground all across the region, and especially in areas adjoining Israel, right? They're going to resettle Gaza. Netanyahu announced that they're going to double the settler population of the Golan Heights. So I think that no durable arrangement, no durable peace is possible until the Israelis stop pushing, and that's a long way away. We'll have to see what the Iranian response is. Iran may have to concentrate on rebuilding its own capabilities, maybe deepening its relationship with Iraq to try to create some more strategic and economic depth. But the situation is very messy. The biggest winners out of all of this have been the Turks, who have earned themselves a free hand in and the major sponsor role in the establishment of a new Syrian government. They now have many more valuable bargaining chips to play to trade away with the incoming Trump administration. They did, however, this will sour the relationship between Ankara and Moscow. And that is a consideration as the war in Ukraine winds down as well. So I think that you'll be looking at a coalition post-conflict government that will be relatively short-lived. And the situation, the underlying security hazards all across Syria have not been resolved. So conditions exist for foreign sponsors to look at organizing armed groups among whoever the losers were of this latest reshuffle. The part of HTS is pliable to al-Jilani, but part of them are committed jihadi ideologues. And so there may also be future conflict as to the direction of HTS in general and to its leadership, as if there isn't enough of a Sunni Islamist character to the subsequent regime. So I see continued instability, although now a different basis, a different environment for that instability to play out.
Electra, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. First, let me start by highlighting the points I fully agree with, that we cannot predict the future for sure. Nobody really has that power. Although I have a gypsy background, I am not a fortune teller myself either. I fully agree with Cuba's final remarks regarding the instability and the fact that in the short term, and I want to highlight that in the short term, Turkey seems to be the main regional winner in this mess because they played their cards very wisely. Gene said something really interesting before, and I was listening to him, that's not necessarily bad news for the Kurds in Syria and the broader region, because it could be a return to the pre-2015 situation with Turkey just exporting the Kurdish issue, or trying to focus on what's happening outside of Turkey and to direct the Kurdish movement towards that direction based on what Jean was just saying. So my contribution, if I am to offer a different perspective, again, has to do with the broader context. And this is what I do by and large, because I am a bigger picture type of person in general. This is my approach to history. We take a lot of things into consideration as givens, right? Starting with this analysis about what the Ba'ath Party was in the Syrian regime. I mean, Bashar al-Assad brought neoliberalism to Syria, and the corruption of that transition to full neoliberalism was precisely what caused all of these reactions eventually during the Arab Spring and all that. So these alliances are not ideological, and they're not stable. So his attachment to Russia was fairly recent, and it cannot be explained in any geostrategic or ideological way that makes any sense. So what I see happening in Syria right now, although things can always go south, that's very plausible. Violence could prevail, and that's a very unfortunately plausible scenario. But what gives me a little bit of hope is that um, the dynamic of Cold War legacies and interventions, which were not black and white, as I said before, is now collapsing, right? There was a certain system in place that is now collapsing. And what I dare identify is agency. Al-Julani does not need to be pushed to do anything. Actually, they prove to be way more capable than we give them credit for. They want to address the international audience and the Western audience in particular. They're using a language that they think we want to hear from them, and they're right. And they're doing this deliberately and with, I would say, a level of sophistication that you wouldn't expect on the end of Salafi jihadis. And the way I would interpret all this is that at the end of the day, for decades now, this whole region has been surrendered to continuous cycles of violence, right? So the options are very limited. You're going to either support the Assad regime or join whomever can fight against them. That does not mean that all of these actors, especially the younger ones, are ideologically motivated or fully controlled by external superpowers that now have to face their own decline, such as the United States of America. I mean, I don't think we should minimize the fact that we are a superpower led by a demented president still in charge. We have just elected Donald Trump for the second time to lead us, appointing all kinds of religious madmen to the Middle East to promote some type of wise strategy about the second coming and all that. So the United States of America is in deep crisis. I think we can all agree on that. And foreign policy, the way I see it, is a manifestation of our own internal crisis. It is a transformative moment for the US as well. And in that vacuum, left behind by the Soviet Union collapsed in the previous century. And yes, Russia can still bite, but its role is very limited. And now the global superpower has to face the tune of its own decline. And in that chaos, although there is so much violence and continuation of conflict in the short term, I dare see, or hope for at least, the emergence of some type of local agency in the vacuum left behind by the collapse of what I have tried to describe as the Cold War order and the problematic legacies of the Cold War order in the 21st century.
Wow, that's a very deep analysis. Very much appreciated. Well,
maybe it's too hopeful, but
I want to thank you all for coming on. I hope you guys will appreciate an invitation to the Mau Mau Hour again and join me for whatever various subject matters that we have to talk about. Thanks again for coming on, and appreciate it. Please have a happy holidays. This has been the Mau Mau Hour with your host, Pascal Robert. Look forward to seeing you on the next Mau Mau Hour. Hopefully, it will be the last Wednesday of January. And as we say on This is Revolution, we are out.
If I tell any secrets of the Mau Mau, this oath will kill me. If I am called in the night and refuse to come, this oath will kill me. If I see anyone steal white man's property, I must help him. I must hide what he gives me and say nothing. or this oath will kill me.
The whole system in this country, the economic system, is such that jobs are scarce. Automation is limiting jobs. It's decreasing jobs. And as automation eliminates the job opportunities, legislation will not create job opportunities. All it will do is bring about friction and hostility between the two races.
You see, there will be no progressive revival if black folks are not deeply involved in it.
I will obey all orders of the Mao